Hello, my name is Jared Allred, and I'm going to be talking to you briefly about what my research group at the University of Alabama is doing. This is a solid-state chemistry group, and we're looking at the physical properties of materials. That puts us in the realm of chemistry and physics, materials chemistry, materials physics. We're looking at the structure-property relationship. Why do we get one set of physical properties in one compound but not in the other? We can look at differences in the atomic structure, you can count electrons and do all sorts of different things to figure that out. So we do this by making materials. We may make known materials that we're studying. We may try to make new kinds of materials to study some property. Then we characterize their atomic structure. We get really deep into trying to understand exactly what's going on with the atoms and the bonds. And we're looking at the properties, typically magnetic and electronic properties. And then we try to build a story out of all of that. Okay, so where does the science come in? Well, you can look at these pictures here. There's no labels, but I hope you can recognize them. We've got LEDs, we've got a solar cell, transistors, magnetic data storage, several Nobel Prizes hiding in here. And all of these depend on having materials that have the right properties. And to get those properties, you have to control the chemistry the right way. You have to know what property you're looking for, and you have to optimize it. And there's too many degrees of freedom to just walk around randomly and hope that you're going to get the property you want. You have to understand what's driving the property that you want. So, got magnetic storage. We need something to read that magnetic storage. The data that's being stored, you need something that has a phase transition that changes its properties when it senses a magnetic field. So you need to understand what's driving phase transitions of that type. Or maybe you want to have a really good semiconductor that has the right properties for the transporting the charge you have. You have to understand how that works. And so from a fundamental science side, there's lots of different kinds of ways electrons can order in materials, magnetically, or maybe just electronically in terms of is it a metal or an insulator, and not all the ways that it can order do we fully understand why it does one thing versus another. And so that's the kind of question my group is really interested in, is how can we understand those things better? So now I just want to kind of give you a sense of what kind of materials we're going to work on. And if you didn't know going in what is a solid state inorganic material, you might guess it looks something like a rock, and that's a good place to start. A lot of the stuff we look at, they're oxides or maybe fluorides or chlorides, sulfides. They have the same structure or even composition as rocks do, as minerals do. So here's a very famous one, Perovskite. Calcium titanate, that's the formula ABX3. And it could be cubic crystals, and you can see these are obviously cubes. But it's a very elastic structure. It can change to encompass all sorts of compositions. And when you do that, you can get different kinds of perovskite structures. So you can change it from being cubic to something else, and then can make those octahedra start tilting and rocking around. You can change the number of types of metals. You can add an extra one and get a double perovskite, two kinds of metal octahedra. Or you can start changing the stoichiometry entirely and remove some of those anions, and you could get different ratio of metal to oxygen. You don't have octahedra all around there. And this is not something my group's working on right now, but it's such a nice example because of how many different materials end up being that have the structure. And now we're seeing hybrid inorganic solar cells. We've seen lots of superconductors and so many more things that are on the structure type. You have to understand the structure comes from this mineral. You have to understand how you can break it and change it. When having this kind of discussion, I also like to show garnet, even though it's not quite as common to be used anymore as perovskite is. It's because it's also cubic, and it has nice minerals too, and you can get gems out of it. It's also got a more complicated structure, even though it's cubic, than perovskite does. And it used to get studied quite a bit, still is. It used to be looked at for magnetic storage, like gadolinium, gallium, garnet. It's still looked into for maybe possible applications of spintronics. That'd be yttrium iron garnet, or YIG. And you've got neodymium YAG, that'd be yttrium aluminum garnet. That's used in lasers. So garnet has been important, and it continues to be important in the future. So I think there's probably a lot of surprises out there for this one as well. I like to show pyrite because everyone loves pyrite mineral crystals. There's a naturally occurring pyrite crystal. And it reminds us to think about carefully about chemistry and electron counting, because we know the iron doesn't like to be 4+, but sulfur likes to be 2-, unless the sulfur makes a bond with itself. So you get dumbbells, and those S2 dimers each have a charge of 2-. So it's -1 per sulfur, and so the iron could end up being 2+. And then we can be comfortable with the charges. This is just a nice example because we can exploit these kinds of ideas when we want to design structures. Here's another one that does a similar thing. It's pyrite. You've got scooterudite. It's got a cooler name than pyrite. And you've got squares of arsenic ions. And so same thing where you have to change how you count your electrons based on the bonds there are between those atoms. So homonuclear bonds are important when we think about structures like this. And scooterudite is another cubic crystal, forms nice, pretty crystals in nature. And we can use it in applications too, thermoelectrics, superconductors, and more. And if you look at that structure, it might look familiar. If you look closely, we just saw this one. So if we go forward, yeah, it's very similar to perovskite. Perovskite has the same looking structure, more or less, different anion, oxygen usually, maybe a halide sometimes instead of antimony or arsenic, germanium, but otherwise it looks very similar. Now oxygen atoms aren't bonded in perovskite usually, but it has that extra cation in perovskite, and so you might wonder, could we jam a cation into scooterudite? And you can. That's called a stuffed scooterudite, and that's something a lot of people have made a lot of interesting materials that way. So, as I said before, superconductors and things like that. So making these analogies can be very helpful when designing new materials with properties that you're interested in. All right, and so finally I'm going to leave you with one last structure, because this is one that my group's working on quite a bit right now. It's the rutile structure. Rutile is a mineral, titanium 4 oxide. You've probably seen it in pigments, white pigment, sunscreen, anything like that. Also sometimes shows up in solar cells, coatings. Very simple crystal structures. Probably one of the simplest ones we've seen in the structures I've shown you. And all of them are pretty simple, but it's really simple. Yet, by looking deeply into how it can change by just small chemical composition changes, we found that it can get really complicated really fast. And so that goes back to the question of properties. What kind of properties can we get as we change that structure? And how do we actually determine the structure we see? So that's one of the big questions we're looking at. So I'm now going to change gears and actually look at, how do we do the kind of work in the lab, just very briefly. So first, got to make them. We do a lot of sort of standard solid-state synthesis methods. So you can see a nice normal front-loading furnace down here on the bottom. You got an induction furnace and also an arc melting furnace. And there are a lot of different ways we can do kind of general solid-state synthesis methods. Okay, let's say you successfully made something. Now you got to see what it is you made. Powder diffraction is a great way to do that. You have X-rays and you use Bragg's law, and you can scan through all these different little crystallites in a powder, polycrystalline sample, and you can see what's in there. You can sometimes even determine if you made a new thing based on analogy from known things. It's a very powerful way of looking at what you've made and determining what it is. If you've grown crystals of something, you can do single crystal diffraction, which can be a very efficient way to actually solve a new crystal structure or something along those lines. So these are two different tools. Both are very important when you're trying to make either new materials or known things that you want to study in more depth. And speaking of more depth, we like to go a little deeper than just these two diffraction methods. And so we want to look at not just the crystal structure, but how the crystal structure is broken by local distortions. And so we can do something called total scattering, which includes something called diffuse scattering on top of what we were doing before in the regular methods. And so this is something my group is learning to specialize in. And you can see that you get these very nice data sets, and then we can transform it to give this really complicated looking blue and red pattern here, which is really like a puzzle. It's showing something about your atomic structure. And you can start putting the pieces together and try to figure out, well, what's going on with the structure, which is an interesting and challenging and exciting thing to do. And of course, finally, it's not good enough to just know what the structure is. If we want to understand the structural property relationship, want to really get that fundamental science, we have to be able to take the same thing and look at what properties it does exhibit and compare that back to the structure. And often, The things we're looking at phase transitions. A lot of things we're interested in are phase transitions. And so if we're looking at two different phases of the same material at two different temperatures, for example, maybe there's a difference in the properties too at those two different phases to change the temperature. So then you can see on the right, we have all these different magnetic measurements. We can see some kind of magnetic transition, depending on if you're looking at temperature or field. You have multiple degrees of freedom. We also look at things like electronic transport that tells you it's a metal or an insulator, which can tell you a lot about something. It's electron count, how are things bonded? Those should match what you see in the properties. You can look at heat capacity, help us learn more about phase transitions. Is it real? Is it really there? What kind of order of phase transition is it? Learn something about the entropy, which is usually quite important. So there's a lot we can do by looking at the properties. We're using pretty standard tools for our field. You know, this is a Dynacool PPMS. So you basically have a probe that you insert inside a dewar with a magnet in it. So you can get to these low temperatures, which is what you need to study the type of phenomena we're interested in. And so that's sort of the short version of what we're doing. We've got these different ways of studying things and making them, and we're trying to understand different kinds of properties. So if you'd like to learn more, please contact me, and I'd be happy to talk to you about what kind of projects we're working on and how you can make an impact in that. So thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.